In 1906, San Francisco was devastated. At 5:12 in the morning, the ground shook with a force that tore the city apart. Buildings collapsed within seconds. Streets split open. Fires spread uncontrollably, burning for 3 days straight. More than 400 city blocks were reduced to ash. But while the world focused on the destruction above ground, something else was happening below it, something no one was supposed to notice. In the weeks that followed the earthquake, cleanup crews were sent into the ruins. Their job was simple: remove debris, clear collapsed structures, prepare the city for rebuilding. At least, that's what the official reports say. But the moment workers began digging beneath the rubble, they encountered something unexpected. Layers, not just dirt, not just broken foundations, but structured layers beneath the city, buried deeper than anyone anticipated. And within those layers, they found tunnels. At first, the discovery didn't seem unusual. Cities often have underground infrastructure, old sewer systems, utility lines, forgotten basements. But these tunnels were different. They were too large, too precise, and most importantly, they didn't match anything in San Francisco's recorded history. Workers described passages wide enough for multiple people to walk side by side. Some were tall enough to stand comfortably inside. Others extended far beyond the excavation zones, disappearing into darkness. The walls were lined with brick, but not just any brickwork. This was something far more refined. The joints were tight. The curves of the arches were nearly perfect. The structure looked engineered with a level of precision that didn't tee a line with 19th century construction methods. And the deeper they dug, the stranger it became. Because beneath the expected layers of the Gold Rush era, there were older sections. And those sections didn't look primitive. They looked advanced. Even more unsettling was the fact that none of this appeared in official reconstruction reports. There were no detailed mentions, no engineering breakdowns, no maps. Instead, a vague phrase began appearing in internal notes. Pre-existing tunnels. That was it. No explanation, no origin. Just a quiet acknowledgement that something was already there before the city. But no one seemed willing to explain what it was. At first, engineers tried to rationalize it. Old mining shafts, abandoned infrastructure, natural formations exposed by the earthquake. But those explanations didn't hold. Because these tunnels weren't random. They were organized, aligned, systematic, as if they were part of a larger network. And that's when the questions began. Why were these tunnels built to a scale far beyond what the city needed at the time? Why did their construction appear more advanced than anything documented in San Francisco's early development? And perhaps most importantly, why were they never officially recorded? Because if these structures existed before the earthquake, then they existed before the city. And if they existed before the city, then who built them? As excavation continued beneath the ruined streets of San Francisco, the initial curiosity began to shift into something else. Confusion. Because what the workers were uncovering didn't behave like a normal city. In a typical urban environment, layers form over time. Older structures sit beneath newer ones, but they rarely align. Different generations build differently. Streets shift. Foundations change. Infrastructure evolves. But beneath San Francisco, that wasn't happening. The layers didn't conflict. They matched. Perfectly. Tunnels from one level ran directly above tunnels from another. Drainage systems followed identical paths across different depths. Passageways, aligned with corridors, buried meters below them. It was as if every phase of construction had followed the same invisible blueprint, one that no longer existed. And that raised a problem no engineer could easily explain, because cities don't evolve like that. Different planners, different time periods, different technologies. They don't accidentally replicate the exact same underground layout across decades. Yet here, they did. The deeper the crews dug, the clearer the pattern became. The uppermost layers resembled known history: brick, timber, materials consistent with late 19th century construction. Below that, things started to shift. The brickwork became tighter, more refined. Arches became smoother, more mathematically consistent. And then, beneath even that, something else appeared. Stonework that didn't resemble anything from the Gold Rush era. Larger passageways, more precise geometry. Structures that felt overbuilt, not improvised, not expanded, but planned. It didn't look like the city had grown downward over time. It looked like the city had been built on top of something that was already there, something structured, something intentional. And then came the detail that disturbed even the most experienced workers. The sediment. Entire sections of the deepest tunnels were packed with hardened mud, not loose debris, not collapsed soil, but dense, compacted layers of earth, as if the tunnels had been buried deliberately or filled over time by something far more extreme than normal environmental conditions. It took days to clear some of these sections. And when they finally broke through, the interiors were intact, untouched, walls smooth, brickwork preserved, as if whatever had filled them had done so without destroying the structure. That raised another question. If these tunnels had been filled naturally, where was the record of an event powerful enough to bury them? There were no documented floods of that magnitude, no geological events matching the depth of the sediment, no historical accounts explaining why entire underground systems would be sealed beneath layers of hardened earth. And yet, the evidence was there. Photographs taken during the reconstruction show workers standing beside these excavated spaces. Some passages were so large that people appeared small in comparison. Arches stretched overhead with near-perfect symmetry. Brick joints were so tight they almost looked fused. And the deeper the layers went, the less they resembled anything familiar. At some point, the workers were no longer uncovering remnants of San Francisco. They were uncovering something else entirely. Something older, something that followed its own rules, and something that didn't fit into the timeline they had been given. At first, the tunnels were enough to raise questions. But what truly unsettled the reconstruction teams were the structures hidden within them. These weren't narrow passages or crude excavations. They were chambers. Large, open spaces constructed with deliberate design. Vaulted ceilings curved overhead with precision that hadn't been expected in anything beneath the city. Walls were uniform. Surfaces smooth. Everything about these spaces suggested intention, not utility, not improvisation, but engineering. Some chambers appeared sealed completely, filled with the same dense sediment found in the deeper tunnels. Workers initially believed they had reached solid ground, but when sections were cleared, they revealed interiors that looked untouched, as if they had been closed and preserved, waiting. And then came one of the most puzzling discoveries of all, the shafts, massive circular openings descending vertically into the earth. At first glance, they were labeled as wells, but that explanation didn't last long, because nothing about them matched typical well construction. They were too perfect, too symmetrical, too deep. Some extended downward for dozens of meters. Others were wide enough for multiple workers to descend side by side. Their walls were smooth, consistent, almost machined in appearance. These weren't holes dug into the ground. They were structures, engineered with purpose. But no one could say what that purpose was. Some speculated ventilation, others suggested access points, but no official explanation ever fully accounted for their design. And then another anomaly appeared. Rails embedded directly into the floors of certain tunnels, metal tracks running in straight, organized lines. At first, the assumption was simple: old mining carts, industrial remnants. But that theory quickly collapsed, because these rails appeared in areas that had never been documented as mining zones. And more importantly, they followed patterns. Not random placement, not scattered debris, but alignment. As if they had once been part of a transportation system, a system that didn't exist in any official record. Some rails were partially corroded, others seemed fused into the surrounding brickwork. But all of them shared one thing in common: they were integrated into the structure itself. Not added later, not temporary, built into the design, and that raised an uncomfortable possibility. These tunnels weren't just empty spaces, they were part of something larger, a network, a system that had been constructed with coordination, with planning, with purpose. And yet, there was no documentation, no blueprints, no references in city archives. Nothing that explained why such an advanced underground system would exist beneath a city that, according to official history, was still developing during the 1800s. The deeper the workers explored, the more the inconsistencies multiplied. Structures that didn't match their surroundings, engineering that didn't match the timeline, features that suggested complexity far beyond what had been recorded. And slowly, without anyone saying it directly, a realization began to take shape. They weren't uncovering forgotten infrastructure. They were uncovering something that had never been properly acknowledged. At some point during the reconstruction, something changed. The discoveries didn't stop, but the documentation did. Early reports had been detailed, measurements, descriptions, observations recorded carefully as the work progressed. But as more of the underground structures were revealed, the tone shifted. Entries became shorter, less specific. Technical language was replaced with vague summaries. Instead of detailed explanations, reports began using phrases like pre-existing structures, unidentified passages, stability concerns. And then, the photographs changed. Earlier images showed workers standing beside massive chambers and exposed tunnels. But later, images became limited, framed differently, focused on smaller sections, avoiding the full scale of what had been uncovered. And in some cases, the photographs disappeared entirely, files scattered, archives incomplete, records that should have been preserved, missing. At the same time, another process began. Sealing. Tunnels that had just been uncovered were filled again. Entrances blocked, passages packed with rubble from the earthquake. Entire sections closed off before they could be fully explored. Officially, the explanation was simple: safety, structural instability, the need to rebuild quickly. But the pattern didn't make sense, because the sections that were sealed first were not the most damaged. They were the most intact, the most precise, the most unusual, the vaulted chambers, the circular shafts. The deeper layers that didn't match the known timeline, those were the ones closed immediately. Meanwhile, less stable areas remained open longer. Documented, studied, left visible. If this was about safety, the decisions seemed reversed. And that's where the questions became unavoidable. Why seal the most structurally sound sections first? Why reduce documentation at the exact moment discoveries became more complex? Why allow fragments of evidence to remain, but never the full picture? By late 1906 and early 1907, much of what had been uncovered was gone again. Buried. Covered by new construction. Returned to darkness beneath the city. What remained were fragments, a handful of photographs, scattered notes, and quiet accounts from workers who had seen the tunnels before they disappeared again. But even from those fragments, a pattern was impossible to ignore. Something had been found. Something extensive, something that didn't fit, and instead of being studied, it had been erased. When you step back and look at the full picture, the pattern becomes difficult to dismiss. Beneath San Francisco, reconstruction teams uncovered tunnels that didn't match known infrastructure, layers that aligned too perfectly across different depths, chambers built with precision beyond expected techniques, circular shafts with no clear purpose, rail systems embedded in tunnels where no rail system should exist. And then, almost all of it was sealed, not gradually, not after years of study, but immediately, as if the decision had already been made. And that leads to a question that goes beyond San Francisco, because if what was uncovered in 1906 truly didn't match the accepted timeline, then what exactly was it? Old infrastructure that had been forgotten? A system built before the city itself? Or something else entirely? There's another possibility, one that isn't often discussed, that these tunnels weren't hidden by accident, but intentionally buried. That the layers of sediment found in the deepest sections weren't the result of natural events, but part of a process, a way of covering something up, preserving it or concealing it. Because if the structures beneath the city were as advanced as they appeared, then they challenge more than just local history. They challenge the idea that we fully understand the past at all, and that might explain the silence. Because some discoveries don't just add to history, they disrupt it. They force questions that don't have easy answers, and they blur the line between what is known and what has been left out. The 1906 earthquake exposed more than just a city in ruins. For a brief moment, it exposed something beneath it. Something older. Something structured. Something that didn't belong to the version of history most people recognize. And then, it was buried again. Sealed. Covered. Forgotten. Or perhaps deliberately ignored. Because the real question isn't just what was found beneath San Francisco. It's how many other cities are built on top of something we've never been told about.